and welcome back to Trek Untold, and this is a special edition of Trek Untold because we are celebrating Captain Picard Week. This event was organized by Strange New Pod, and it's a week-long festival of a bunch of different Star Trek podcasts covering topics about everyone's favorite Frenchman with a British accent, Captain Jean-Luc Picard. But I am not alone on this endeavor because today I am joined by two very special guests.
Hey, I'm Hawk, he, him. I'm a co-host on Strange New Pod. I also contribute to Geeks with Kids. I'm just a general fan of everything sci-fi, fantasy, and all the other good stuff.
And hi, I'm Jeff Akin, he, him. I'm the host of the Starfleet Leadership Academy. And much like Hawk, if it's sci-fi, if it's nerdy, if it's great, I'm all in for it. Thanks so much for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
And for those who don't know, I'm Matthew Kaplowitz, he, him, host of the Trek Untold podcast, which is a weekly interview series where I chat with folks across the Star Trek universe who have contributed in different ways. We get to know a little bit about what they do, talk a little bit of Trek, and go into all sorts of crazy, deep directions, much like we're going to end up doing today, folks. So, there are a ton of other podcasts who are joining this festival, so if you are new to this event, if you're just listening to it for the first time because you're a fan of my podcast or any of these other gentlemen's, do make sure to check out strangenewpod.com for all of the details about everybody else who's joining this big event here. Again, there's a lot of folks, and they're all covering specific topics, and the topic that I got today that we're going to be discussing is a very heavy, deep one. It's going to be a rough one to get through, and our topic is Locutus of Borg, Jean-Luc Picard, and trauma. And, the word trauma is a very big word here, so I do want to just kind of start this off before we begin our discussion, letting people know that we're going to get into some pretty sensitive, very heavy topics here. So if you are uncomfortable with it, if you're not really into listening to this episode because of that, not a big deal here. So, we won't take offense if you can't handle this one here. It's all good, folks. That's kind of like my viewer discretion is advised warning for everybody out there. Let's go ahead and I think we can just jump right on in at this point here. And really my kind of question was, where do we start? With a topic like this, because it's such a big, broad topic also. It's going to get real heavy very quick, as we've been alluding to. So I think what I'd like to kind of do is take it from where it begins, and that's trying to identify what kind of trauma Picard faced when he first became Locutus. I think that there is an obvious analogy here for body autonomy, especially in Best of Both Worlds Part 2, where, one of the things that stood out to me rewatching that episode again was the scene where Picard sheds a single tear as he's being turned into the Borg, because he has absolutely zero control over what's happening. He is just essentially trapped in the shell of his body and numb while all this is going on. He's been physically violated, he's been mentally violated, and this is an abuse that will continue indefinitely because there's really nothing he can do to stop this. He is completely frozen. So, and this, of course, then goes into him becoming Locutus and all that stuff. But let's just first kind of try to maybe label and identify what's going on here. So, what do you see as the trauma that Picard deals with? And I'm going to throw it over to Hawk first. What are your thoughts on this topic here?
Well, with him, this is interesting. It's definitely a physical violation that he's going through in that, basically his body is being subjected to, a transformation in that through medical procedures. But more than that, it is not just bodily in that, but psychologically in that. Everything Picard is being not taken from his individual body and thrown into the collective of the Borg in that. All that knowledge, everything that he had acquired, and that is basically is about to be used to wage war on his own federation. And I don't know if that point he's really aware of the situation, but we definitely see afterwards in that psychological effect and trauma carried on with him in that, knowing that he was used as a tool to help destroy his own people.
How about you, Jeff? What are your thoughts on this one here?
Well, it goes so deep, and Matthew,
it really
I think
does.
Pointing out body autonomy is so great. I want to step deeper down. So it's digging into the layers where Star Trek attacks so many great topics. And I think some of them they do without even knowing they're doing it, right? So this episode was at 89, 90 when it came out. And so, at that point in our society, we thought of diversity, or multiculturalism, as we called it back then, as really being about what color our skin was in a lot of ways. But now we know so much more. And what I saw when I rewatched this was I imagined a person of color or a person who's not cisgendered or has a non-binary, gender, having to being forced to conform to something that's not them in order to fit in, right? So if I look back on my career working in the corporate world or whatever, like that was the uniform you had to put on. I don't like wearing, I don't want to present this way, I don't want to act, this is not who I am, but when I'm at work I have to be this person. But in the transformation of Picard to Locutus, not only did that transformation have to happen, but he had no say in that. So imagine a person that's trans and doesn't conform to, maybe has a neurodiversity, and these things suddenly being pulled away and having all that individuality ripped from them, and then being like, no, you are now a cisgendered heterosexual white person who does everything. Like, I read all that into just that. I mean, literally that one scene you described when the tear fell from his face, because it's just, I could feel that. And I think I've worked with people, and I think we all have probably worked with people who have experienced that. And I can think of one colleague I have in particular who to this day deals with that trauma on a regular basis, and just how impactful that is.
I think it's a very interesting point, and I didn't really even think about that too much. Kind of going back to my past and maybe the first time I ever watched it, the way I'm looking at it today is so different from how I looked at it back then. Because back then it was just, he's being assimilated. I just looked at it from the sci-fi perspective, and now as an adult I can see so much more of like the assault and the actual abuse he went through, the mental and the physical abuse, the violation. And I really found it interesting too how you kind of made it into the trans perspective. That's a really interesting way to approach it.
I think that we're really good as a society of like forcing people into boxes, and what better box than a Borg cube, and it's one of those things. It's like,
5 points to Gryffindor.
Yeah. But it's just total prescient kismet, where it's like, who knew that they nailed it this close? But everything that happened with Locutus from this point forward, like that thought, I couldn't get rid of it. That stuck with me the whole time.
Kind of similar to this path that we're on right now, and that's another part I want to highlight from Best of Both Worlds, is where Picard is clutching Data's arm endlessly once they do rescue him from the Borg cube. And, I feel like Picard is using Data as a physical reminder of who he is, but, kind of going beyond this too, I think he's also desperately clinging to Data in fear of going back to who he just was as Locutus. I think it's a real subtle, very powerful piece of acting from Patrick Stewart, and he does it for basically, the entire time he's in Data's lab, once he starts to come to. So I wonder if any of you guys picked up on that also, and how you interpreted that moment.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because now I'm looking back on it differently, in that, he clings to Data in that. I think because of that, they've always had that special relationship throughout the series, and that, like, Data and Picard, Picard has always seen himself as a bit of a mentor to Data, and that in the ways of humanity and that, but also he tends to see humanity through Data's eyes too, and that almost like the way we see, like, life through the eyes of a child. And that relationship is probably why, like, Picard, clung to him that way, trying to regain his humanity back from his own student.
I think too, what a moment of vulnerability, and kind of almost selfishly, and maybe not intentionally, but who better to be vulnerable with than the person is not going to pass any judgment on you, right? Like Data, he's just like, yeah, okay, I'm here.
Yeah, I think using the word vulnerability, this is like a great spot to start incorporating that word into this conversation here, because when we cover topics like trauma and assault especially, it is very much about vulnerability. It's being vulnerable in a situation where you have no choice over it, and then trying to then take that back, trying to take yourself back and take who you are back. So, I guess when we talk about the whole process of becoming Borgified, if you will, basically Picard is forced to be completely vulnerable in every way. He has no option here. What's going on? We have to go back to the body autonomy argument. And now at this point, with Data, he's now been rescued. He's trying to get something back. He's trying to put up another barrier maybe at this point. It's a little bit hard to say, but, there's a lot going on there. It's an interesting piece.
I wonder, and this isn't something I'd thought of until we were just having this conversation, but I wonder if there's got to be the trauma of returning, right? Like, so I don't think he ever accepted being Locutus, like, okay, this is what it's going to be. But there was the moment where he's just like, I guess, and then he comes back. And I wonder, and through Voyager, 7 of 9 talks about the comfort of the collective, right? And just the voices that were there, and how she really struggled with the silence when she was pulled out. And I can't help but think if maybe that grasping of Data was maybe a little bit of just that, I'm suddenly alone again, in there. And so it's like we can look at that moment as a win, like this big triumph. I'm not Borg anymore. But we know, right, because we're going to talk about all these other episodes, that Borg's still a piece of him, in some way. And I wonder if there's just that trauma of being an individual again.
Yeah, the final scene in Best of Both Worlds Part 2, and that when he's in the office and that going through the duty list and that, and it's like he was holding the cup of tea to his lips and that, and just as he's about to take a sip, he stops and he realizes, like, I can't go back to the way things were. And the way he looked out the window towards Earth, and that, I think it preemptively introduced in the next episode. As he's looking down on Earth, it's almost like he's on autopilot, like that survival and programming mode that he goes into says, I need to go home.
Yeah. I kind of wonder if there's a little bit of maybe, I don't know if Stockholm syndrome is the right word, but there's a tendency with a lot of folks where if they're in an abusive situation, they will stick with the abuser through it still. And I wonder if that's a feeling that Picard was going through. I don't really necessarily think it is, but there's definitely, the fact that he did have such a deep connection. I think that can be reflected in the idea of like an abusive relationship where you're afraid to get out because you're so familiar with it. You're so deep into it that it's just so hard to claw your way back out.
I think a survival instinct is you have to kind of accept your reality, and it's hard, I'm sure I could go on and see how long, but like the moment from when he was assimilated to the moment he became unassimilated wasn't overnight, right? Like stuff happened in there. And so he had to have been doing some math in terms of just like, is this my life now, and then to generally and pretty suddenly not have that be your life, and you still have that connection. And I think we see, and we'll talk about like the progression he goes through of just absolute outright hate, towards the Borg, and how in the Star Trek Picard that evolves a little bit in there over time, and that, so I think it's gonna be interesting for us to talk through that change, because right now, Hawk, you were right, he's just lost, and it's almost, I don't want to read too much into it, but it's like I got to go home, almost like I have to go back to my alcove, sort of like I must do the thing. And it's got to be wrestling with so much.
When you mentioned Stockholm syndrome and that, I think it's more, I don't see it more as Stockholm syndrome, because that implies like, you've developed like empathy and like an emotional attachment to your abuser and that. I would say he's going through survivor's guilt, more than anything else.
It's funny you mentioned survivor's guilt, because I actually had something I was thinking about as well with that, because we're kind of really jumping ahead here, but I was reminded a little bit of DS9 and the DS9 pilot, which is the first and only face-to-face on-camera interaction we get between Commander Sisko and Captain Picard. And they really haven't met necessarily, but Sisko has sort of met him because he met Locutus, and their interaction is pretty cold, not the best obviously. So it kind of got me wondering if Picard actually does feel survivor's guilt, because he did take a lot of lives, but I mean, he felt pretty detached when he had that moment with Sisko, and this is a point where he is coming face to face with someone who his abuse basically lashed out towards. So I mean, do you believe in this instance, is there some, we know that Picard feels remorse, but is there survivor's guilt? Does he feel like, should it have been me, or is it at this point for him it's just like, what happened, I can't do much about this?
It's definitely survivor's guilt. You can see it in Brothers, and that when as he goes home, and that whole, and for some reason his brother knew exactly the right buttons to push. He seemed to instinctively know what Picard needed at that moment to get over what was happening, because like he had been cold and detached the whole time he was there. He was home with family and that, but it was still Captain Picard and that, and Renee managed to break down that barrier and that by pushing his buttons enough to provoke an emotional response from him and that. And after they got that fight out of the way, like that's when all the tears, all the sadness came back, and it's like, I wasn't strong enough, I wasn't good enough, and delving into his backstory in that episode, and that, like, how he had pushed himself to be an achiever, how he had separated himself from like his family's traditional values, and that being taken and like, emptied, of those things that made him who he was, and that, like, the scars will have been there forever. And his brother, God bless him, helped him manage to put it into perspective.
I think you hit on the key thing there. Like, he had to be Captain Picard, and in that moment with Commander Sisko, he was being Captain Picard. I think there's just that call where when I'm at work, I have to be at work, and I have to be this. And at this point, the legend of Captain Picard is out there, and so he's got to live up to that ideal in front of this commander, this punk who's going to run this, and last corner of the galaxy space station. That dude, just come over here and keep stuff cool. You're seriously going to bring me, I mean, obviously there's a lot more there, but I think that was kind of the interplay there where Sisko's laying it on the line. Dude, you killed my wife. You killed my captain. You destroyed my ship. And Picard's like, yep, those things happened. This is your assignment. I'm here to help you in these ways, and then I'm out of here. And again, like I said earlier, I think we have worked, all of us and all the people listening have worked with someone like that. You're like, hey, I need to miss some work. This horrible thing happened. And they're like, well, I'm really sorry to hear that, but, really need you on the shift coming in. So, rub some dirt on it and get back in here. Picard was that guy in there, but in family, Hawk, you're so right. That whole thing with his brother, like, so good. And I think my favorite thing when they're in the mud and just crying, one that his brother did was genius, but that Picard also did. Well, the Jean-Luc did. They're both Picard, but he starts crying and he just let him go. Like, he let it happen, and his brother let it go. He didn't dive in and try to be like, it's okay. He just let him say the stuff that needed to happen. And I think that's where we, as people adjacent to other people's traumas, I think it's where we mess up sometimes. We want to go in and fix. But the thing is, they actually have to express. That's a huge part of it. And Renee let that happen. Jean-Luc let that happen. And that was the magic moment in that whole episode.
So I definitely want to come back to family because there is a whole lot to break down that happens in this episode. But I actually want to take one step further backwards for a minute here. I want to just look at the Borg and consider them and how they relate to trauma. And I think it's Unimatrix Zero in Voyager, where we see a group of Borg remembering who they were before they became the Borg, and that kind of reminds me of a shared trauma. That's a term I think we've heard a lot, especially right now during COVID-19 times, where so many people as a group kind of fell into the same traumatic event because we're all dealing with COVID-19. So there's this mass depression across the entire world. It's something, and we're all basically having this shared experience together. And to me, the Borg are kind of having this shared traumatic experience that is essentially keeping them traumatized and paralyzed, if you will, as part of this collective. As much as they want to get out, they're so paralyzed to do so. And even in that scene in Unimatrix Zero, we see them saying, oh, no, you shouldn't have that thought. You shouldn't think that way. No, we're here. This is how we are. It's just the way things are. So they're essentially surrounded by self-defeated people who just can't improve their situation and don't really want to. So, I'm kind of curious to what you guys think the Borg represent as a whole when it comes to trauma.
A very interesting question. Jeff, maybe you want to go first. I got my thoughts on this.
Well, I think because there's a couple times throughout the whole, the whole franchise that we see Borg that have been pulled from the collective, right? So they're somehow disconnected. The Descent double part, two-parter, iBorg, some of the early ones. And I think like 100% of the time that they're separated, somebody gets the idea of just like, yeah, this doesn't work. It's basically like the Borg separated become an Ayn Rand novel all of a sudden of just like, we're going to tear this thing down and, take it apart. And, I am the individual. I can do these things. And so I think it is. And I think they used sci-fi to basically say, you don't have any autonomy. You don't have any decision making. It's all gone. But the reality is it's still there. And like the thought I just had is we know that with Picard as Locutus, he was like a spectator, watching everything happen, horrified and couldn't. Is that what every Borg goes through all the time? And I think, yeah, we'd learned that through 7 of 9 story. But yeah, I think like to take it back to Next Generation, Hugh, I think through Next Generation and Picard really embodies exactly that.
One of the biggest things I take away from like the whole experience of people who kind of become disassimilated from the collective is the first emotion that they seem to really react upon is anger and the hatred and that wanting to, get back at their abusers, somehow. This came up a couple times when I was watching it. First with iBorg, when Picard first meets Hugh and looks at him not as a survivor like he was, but look potentially as a way of getting back at the ones who abused him and caused him this trauma. The second was I'm glad you mentioned the Descent, because I had to go back and rewatch it, and that because I kind of largely forgotten about it. But Lore used these disassimilated Borg in that to wage his war, his supposed war on the Federation and that. But he tapped into their anger and their hatred and their fears. First of all, that he wasn't there to save them, and that he didn't try to coax them back into humanity, and that he took advantage of the one thing that victims of trauma can always be relied upon, and that is to be experiencing an enormous amount of rage and fear and hatred.
And I think what's interesting too to bring up Descent is, we're kind of looking at, as we mentioned, the collective shared trauma. What this episode's topic is really centered towards Picard. Picard had a singular experience, which we're making a lot of allusions to being, about self-autonomy and other things like that. But when you look at it from an entire group, and let's say the entire Borg, you can now look at it from the angle of like, is this like a religious cult kind of thing? Is it like some kind of group of people who've now pulled you in and you can't get back out? I mean, it's interesting how there's a lot of ways to look at the same kind of trauma.
Yeah, and I think that this is still super relevant because Picard became a part of that. It's almost because he became the spokesperson, like to go on the religious cult piece. Like it's almost like he got pulled into the cult without wanting to, right? I think that's a key part of the whole thing. And then was immediately made like a leader of that cult. It's like, go do this thing. And then immediately was pulled out of that. And it's like in Iborg, Hawk, you're right, when he was just like, they're talking about the virus they want to put in there. And Dr. Crusher, as she often is kind of the voice of reason, being like, we're talking about genocide here. And Picard's like, yeah, I sure hope so. Like, that's good. And that's so not Picard, like no. In that moment. Yeah.
I mean, this is Captain Picard advocating genocide and that, it's not the same guy we saw who, successfully argued for Data's rights in Measure of a Man. It's not the same guy who successfully argued for humanity's right to exist in the Encounter at Farpoint. This was somebody who was just acting out on pure rage. Yeah. And I hadn't even considered the idea of the cult angle in that for the Borg, because I always think of it in the way they just basically people had no choice in that, but the cult angle is interesting.
So let's go ahead now and jump actually into family, because I already mentioned I got a lot to say about this also, and it's an interesting one for me because this is where the healing process does begin to happen here. From the opening act, we see that Picard is essentially in denial. And that's an important thing to note here. It's a common way that people will cope with unhealthy things. It's an unhealthy way to cope with it, but it's, his way of dealing with it in the beginning. People will place boundaries in front of others in various ways, and part of that is them denying that they were ever even afflicted by anything. So, when we head into this episode, it's an interesting one because Picard is dealing with attachment issues also. And this is something we've seen in other episodes, namely, he doesn't like to attach to things, especially family, especially, children. That's probably part of why he's not really a fan of kids. It's an attachment issue for him. So, this is, again, another boundary issue. And this is something I kind of noticed when I was rewatching it, too, is like right before Picard leaves to go back to France, he takes like books with him from his ready room because it's almost like a security blanket. And, this is like the one place that he can be safe in. And that's also why he gives the room one last look before he actually does depart, because he doesn't want to go. He's just that deep in denial. He's that stuck in his head that he can't leave this environment. So, inexplicably, Picard does head home, even though he's reluctant to do there. And when he gets there, he pretty much remarks how nothing has changed. It's the same of how it was from childhood. And I feel like that's what Picard was looking for. As I mentioned, he's kind of putting up boundaries now, and that's to fully avoid addressing anything he needs to do to make changes to himself because he's so deep in this denial. So, to me, he wants to go to this one place that is a constant, and that includes the constant issues with his brother Robert that, really haven't been fixed up until this point at all, ever. It's kind of like he chooses to deal with a familiar pain rather than fight with a new pain. It kind of reminds me of a story. This is making a deep cut now. It kind of reminds me of a story from James Joyce's Dubliners titled Sisters. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but basically the story, it very much deals with paralysis and a mental state of paralysis. And that ultimately is what leads to the continued decline of this pair of sisters who are, at this point in the story, very old. They've had this big, long life together, and it's all just kind of filled with heartache and tragedy, and they're kind of content with it. Why do you think Picard ultimately did head to Labar, and what do you think he actually accomplished by doing so? I mean, was he just going there because he wanted to keep himself in a depression that he was used to and really never expected to accomplish any healing? Or, was there actual intent to really make change? It just, ultimately it kind of just happened anyway.
It's interesting because, like, from what we understand, in that this was a place he did everything he could to escape from, and that, the father was a traditionalist. He didn't like modernism. He didn't like technology, and that. And Picard's whole, career has been about advancement and technology, and pioneering and exploring, and that. And it's like, this is a place that's just a constant, no technology, old, like, they still cook by hand in it. Again, what he was after was basically, I think, comfort and protection. Like, obviously there was issues with his older brother, and that, I mean, can you imagine, like, your little brother is the achiever in the family, and that, and in most families, and that the eldest has the most responsibility and the most expectations, and that. And yet it was Picard, and that who got out. But at the same time, it's that he's still seeking that comfort from the brother. Like, even though they don't get along, at the core, he knows his brother still has his back.
I think you add to that, and thank you, Matthew. I think both Hawk and I called Robert Rene. So many R's.
I thought Rene too. Sorry.
I know. But Robert's also dealing with the fact that Rene is basically another Jean-Luc, where he wants to overachieve and do these things. And, he's the one who's stuck there doing this stuff. And so there's a lot of interconnecting pieces in here. But I think in Family, one of the things I loved was we actually got to see Counselor Troy counseling, like,
That's
actually
thing,
performing. Yeah, she's actually performing and really well. She was being a really good therapist in there too. So there's the one of the couple of episodes. But I think, as someone who takes advantage of therapy, who believes that mental health is part of our total health, and gosh, I wish more people would get on board with that. But I think there comes a level of attending therapy or participating in it where you're like, yep, I'm going to do the things that my therapist tells me to do and check the boxes and just kind of get them off my back. And I think that was kind of what he was doing. He's like, yep, I told you about my dreams. Yep, I'm doing the thing. Oh, you want? Yeah, I'll take some shore leave. That's cool. I'll do it. I'll go home where I can just kind of be in this place where I know what it's going to be. Also, like, I think he knows he gets to leave. You know what I mean? So he's like, yeah, I'll go there. It's temporary. It's not a permanent thing. I can deal with that. But he does, to your point earlier, he takes parts of home, his quarters on Enterprise, with him in there. So he's like, yep, I'm going to totally go. I'm also going to avoid the issue entirely. Come back, and then I'll continue checking the boxes, counselor. Thank you.
It's like, basically, he wanted to put in the bare minimum, and he wasn't really expecting to get much out of it.
Yeah, but surprise, he got a lot out of it.
One of the things I liked in this episode was his relationship with Robert, and at one point Robert says to him how he wants to see Picard out of control, and that pretty much comes in, I think, the last act.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to see him out of control, which to me, I feel, is how Picard views his time as Locutus, because, we already mentioned, I mentioned a bunch of times body autonomy, but more so just the idea of, the assault and just not having any control whatsoever over what's happening around you, what's happening to your body, what's happening to how you interact with other people. So, I really think that Picard is very much kind of struggling with dealing with that issue still, and, Locutus was Picard unhinged, and I don't think that Picard liked that, but did a part of him like not having the responsibility of being a Starfleet captain? And does he feel guilt over the fact that he might have felt that way about it? Because, sometimes trauma does affect your brain. Your brain will lie to you in different ways. And I wonder, how much of him maybe, he didn't like, obviously, the fact that he massacred a whole lot of people, but maybe he liked the fact that he didn't have to play captain for a little while.
I doubt it. I really doubt it. Because even going back to Q when Q basically introduced, like, Picard and everybody to the Borg, and that, looking back on that when I was rewatching, and that scene at the end where Picard was basically he admitted defeat to him, and conceded that he was arrogant and that he was not prepared. That last line when he says we're frightened, I think he's basically saying I'm frightened, in that, because he was basically confronted with the opposite of what he's always been in his life. This individual who was an achiever, and, like, watching the system of a society where not one individual matters in it. It's all part of a whole. And that, I think that was probably his biggest fear he was confronting. That even though, like, he seems like a humble guy, I think there is a lot of ego to the character.
That's what
And
Ribeiro was saying to him the entire episode too, is how arrogant he used to be, or at least that's what his uncle nephew was saying to him also. What's that word? Arrow what now? But yeah,
arrogant.
exactly. Yeah, and I totally feel what you're saying though about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it even came up in Tapestry, right? For his, or no, not Tapestry. What am I thinking? Impossible Box, where Rafi's talking. It's like, yep, for as much ego as he is, he's even more id, in that. So I agree, Hawk. I don't think it was him not wanting to have the responsibility. I think it was him feeling the failure, whether it was really his failure or not. He has so much ego attached that he wrapped himself around it, and so he saw himself as failing as a captain. So he ran away. And he ran away to home in Labar. And then I think what's fascinating then, if you look fast forward ahead, when he was made an admiral and was given kind of the, hey, you need to help evacuate Romulus and the Romulan Star Empire, or the Romulan Empire, and failed, for, if you read the novel, for reasons outside of his control. But what did he do? He ran away and he disappeared. It's almost like his ego can't handle being a failure. And so I think we get that little piece here, but we get a bigger piece that leads to the whole series, of Picard. But in this one, I think, and Matthew, you said earlier how trauma really impacts the brain in there. And I'm fortunate in that I work with some behavioral health professionals. I am not a behavioral health professional by any means, but it's a thing I hear them talk about a lot, is how trauma, especially capital T trauma, which is what he experienced here, literally rewires your brain for survival. And I think what we see through family really is him in a a really compressed moment of trying to deal with that fact. His brain, the way his brain used to work and the way his brain worked as Locutus, are now clashing in real time in Picard.
And to kind of tie everything together, I think, because you both made some excellent points here, I feel like it is very much that arrogance and the ego of Picard that makes him resistant to really doing much of, putting a maximum effort, if you will, to make a change in any way. And of course, that does damage someone's brain, if you will. We don't really think about that, but that kind of thing that you're going through, the fact that you already went through a traumatic experience is already putting some stress onto your cranium. At this point now, you're basically making it worse for yourself, and you're kind of just refusing to go out there, make the changes you need to do to get yourself healed up. And that kind of leads me to my next question here. And, many parts make up the sum of who Picard is, and some of those things are better than others. I mean, from my perspective, Picard is diplomatic. He's able to consider other people's opinions when he's making big decisions. But, the question is, does he think of himself enough? And, the examples you just kind of gave, it's very much him running away, not wanting to confront these things. So, what would you guys say are the character traits of Picard that would help progress his healing, and what hinders this healing also? I guess, obviously we already talked about the arrogance, so that's definitely a big hindrance, but do you see anything else hindering him from moving forward, or how he moves forward?
It's odd because, like, for someone who's such a student of humanity and that, when it comes to dealing with issues of the Borg after the event and that, like, he seems to default back to hatred and and fear and anxiety. That is what we see with, in Borg and that, and the way his initial treatment of Hugh. He's able to get past that when he actually has to confront Hugh, before sending him out on this, suicide, not suicide mission. Well, actually suicide mission, but yeah, he actually has to confront his fears, of the Borg. But then, like, with First Contact, when the situation was so dire and that, he defaulted back to, fear and anxiety, and that, you remember, like, the whole scene in the the holodeck ballroom and that, where he guns down like those Borg and that, and then starts digging into them and that, and Sloan points out, is that one of your crewmen? He forgets his humanity when with around the Borg, and it's a lesson that he doesn't even really learn even up until the Impossible Box. He still, when they're tasked with having to go to the reclamation site of the artifact, and like how his fears over that, like he defaults back into anger in that. And we see, it's only after he goes through that whole panic attack, which, by the way, is a fantastic scene in that. Like, I had an anxiety disorder, and that, like, panic attacks are just the worst in that. It's not just psychological, it is very much physiological symptoms of dizziness and, like, upset stomach, and like the way you just can't seem to find your bearings in that. And yet it's Hugh who basically pulls him back, and it's like, greets him like with such humanity in that, and recognizes him as his savior. And that I think that was the most important breakthrough he had, was finding Hugh at that point.
If you don't mind, too, I just want to talk a little more about that point as well, because the response you talk about, it's very much an irrational response, which is caused by this trauma, and so that puts up a boundary, and that boundary isn't an irrational boundary; it's an immediate kind of response to the situation. And bringing up Borg is real great, because we've talked about his reaction to the Borg, and it's very much an implicit bias that he's feeling towards these people. And basically, as I was thinking about that episode too, I was kind of trying to decide, like, is Picard's reaction wanting to destroy the Borg, and especially the way he reacts towards Hugh in the beginning, was it passive aggressive, or was it just straight up aggression? But it's tough to really figure that one out, because that's what happens when you have this implicit bias, which manifests during trauma. It kind of it brings a negative memory to just kind of repeat itself and give you a preconceived notion of what's going on, even if it's not the truth. That is, again, your brain lying to you. That's the essentially, when we say the brain damage caused by trauma, that's kind of things we mean by it. Depersonifying the Borg, especially, it kind of makes sense that he would do that. But I like your point about how he does kind of lose his humanity. I think that's a great example of it. So that's just me piping in for no reason. But Jeff, go ahead. Yeah, I know you had something to say also about this.
Yeah, no, and I think it's so brilliant. He lost his humanity, but was brought back by the humanity of one who was Borg. There's a lot just in that. But even after that, they're on the artifact, as they call it, and they're helping the XBs recover, just from the physical nature of the implants and stuff. And he has a quote in there. I actually wrote it down. He says, "This is how people need to see the XBs and see the Borg. They're victims. They're not monsters." And you contrast that to when he first met Hugh and Borg, when he's like, "Yeah, I want to murder every last one of these things." And that's, I think, what it shows is there's not a quick fix to trauma. You don't take a pill or go to therapy twice and call it good. I mean, this was 30 years or something that he went through huge spikes with, what we saw in First Contact and those pieces to get to that moment of realization. And it probably didn't come together until he and Hugh embraced, and they're like, "Oh my God, it's so good to see you." It was such a great scene. But I think, Matthew, your question was really around what, the things that stopped Picard from doing this. And I think it goes back to the image of Captain Picard. I think he bought in to the hype of who he was, and he just didn't have the humility or the vulnerability to be able to say, "Yeah, I'm not feeling good. I'm not seeing the world right, and I need some help." There's an article there's a lot of articles on the internet, actually. I don't know if you know that or not. It's full of articles, but there's one that I found that was so good, and it basically laid out why, after Best of Both Worlds specifically, but especially then after Tapestry and after Chain of Command and Inner Light, they're like, yeah, Captain Picard is not fit for command after all this trauma in there. And it really centered down onto the fact that he wouldn't stop, pause, ask for, and accept help.
Yeah, and again, this episode especially is very much focused just on Locutus of Borg, but we do know that Picard has faced a whole lot of other traumas out there, and I think you guys also had some more thoughts you might want to go into more detail on, because I know there's the Inner Light, there is Chain of Command, there's a bunch of other stuff. So what comes to mind is something we have talked about already a few times, that is Romulus. And really, that is essentially what Picard Season 1 really starts to be about, in the beginning at least, is Picard is kind of still dealing with the guilt over what happened at the end of Nemesis and what that has caused, because, here we are 20 years later, and he's still getting asked the same questions about the situation that he's had to deal with for quite some time. It's a decision that, he don't have much of a choice in how things happen, but he is essentially responsible for it. So he is carrying the burden single-handedly, much like he single-handedly carried the burden of being Locutus, causing the Battle of Wolf 359, and basically winning it for the Borg. So, it's just more weight that you're adding, more little pebbles that continue to pile up onto Picard's very shiny, bald head. And, as we mentioned, the Impossible Box does go into some of the stuff with the Borg, and we do get some Borg stuff, but, that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg here. So, yeah, if you guys want to go into a little bit more about anything else, feel free to.
I was gonna say, failure was even before the Enterprise, and that failure was something that he has experienced, and that we heard, we all know the story with the Stargazer, and that it was brought before a court martial, and that for basically the loss of a ship, and that which is in the military can end a career like that, and yet survived. He came through that, not just that, but to become the captain of the Federation's flagship. So we think he would be somebody who was capable of dealing with failure a lot better than he is. He even has to give advice to Data in the episode. I'm trying to remember the name. When Data begins to doubt his own programming and that after he's beaten in that Stratagema game by the tactician. Yes. And he's like, it's possible to make all the right decisions and still lose. You'd think somebody that wise and who has gone through that much in his career and that would have a better grasp of how to deal better with failure.
I think that might be a case of that's what's good for you isn't necessarily good for me, right? To me, it keeps kind of landing on what I call like society's dominant toxic culture, where like, well, I'm the dude in charge, so I'll give you the great advice, but I have to hold myself to a higher standard and stuff, and also the fact that it's a sci-fi show written in the 80s and 90s and continuity wasn't necessarily the the priority for a lot of what they did.
Speaking from experience from chatting with folks on my podcast, especially, I hear from actors all the time who said their mental health was just in the garbage the entire time they were doing shows. And that's coming from folks who were character actors or even folks who were regular cast members, like they didn't get a chance to even heal themselves while they were being performers. And they got to play these characters who are equally traumatized, if not more so.
Yeah. Well, I think about Chain of Command Part 2, right? And what I adore about that episode is that it was kind of a passion project for Patrick Stewart. He fought hard to keep the script what it was. He filmed those scenes on a closed set in the nude. He wanted it to be so real that people were disturbed by it, because these are the things they conferred with Amnesty International. He had a message he wanted to deliver, and I think they did a great job. But to your point, he had to go through that torture and display it and demonstrate it, and then get like a day off, and then the next day go in and start filming some lighthearted, whimsical episode about some sci-fi thing, like, oh, everything's fine. And it wasn't, right? There's no way that could have been fine for Patrick Stewart, let alone Jean-Luc Picard.
And, we spent so much this episode kind of not really beating on Picard, but we've been kind of laying it thick on Picard and all the stuff he's dealing with here, and it's been pretty unpleasant. But, as we come to a wrap for this particular episode of Captain Picard Week here on Trek Untold, we've been talking a little bit about the Impossible Box and that moment, that reunion that he has with Hugh. And, to me, this is like that moment when they did have that embrace. That's like kind of when all the experience kind of just dissipated, if you will. It definitely felt like the weight was finally really lifted off of his shoulders. And, this is an episode that we're talking about trauma. We've been talking about paralysis, but I want to talk about catharsis. So was this finally the moment of catharsis for Picard? And, do you believe that he is truly now free of, at the very much, the Locutus trauma?
I doubt free is the word for it. I think it's something he will always carry. His brother told him as much back in family, and that, this is something you're going to have to carry with you for a long time. And that, you mentioned about the books and that. I thought that was interesting, because I thought, when I was thinking about that, it's like, this is not something you can put in a box. This is not one of his books he can just put on his shelf and that and call back, when he wants to, and that. It's something he'll have to carry with him his entire life and that. But I think with an Impossible Box, that scene of seeing so many, of the people that Hugh had helped in that, and thinking back that, it's like, I took a chance, he could have just sent Hugh off and that with a program in his head and wiped out the entire Borg culture and that. But he took a chance, recognizing that Hugh was somebody who still had humanity in him, that who was capable of being saved. It was like the fruits of the seed, that it was a seed that he planted in that, and it's like even 30 years later he got to see the fruition of it, and that one person he helped thousands of others.
Yeah. And I think too, talking about seeds, I don't know if it's the moment, but it's a moment, so a moment was Robert and him in the vineyard, right? And having that moment where he broke down and acknowledged it. He had a moment with Sloane in First Contact, when she was just like, what, dude, that was a second ago. That was one of your crewmen. And, he had those moments that went in here, but I think this was a big one. And where I think it's one that I think really starts kind of building momentum for him on the path. Is they embrace it, brings that anxiety for him into focus. But even as they're moving through and they're heading to the Queen's chamber, he continues to have these flashes and these memories, and Hugh is kind of guiding him through that shared trauma we talked about. And when they get in the Queen's chamber, and he was like, "You've never been here before, but you know what it is." And he's like, "Yeah, me too. I know, it's just there." So he has that moment where they can connect, and he knows he's not alone in this. And I think, fortunately, unfortunately, whatever, the series kind of took a turn in the direction towards the synth piece, which is great. I'm sure it's fine. It'd be cool if they did more exploration on the Borg thing. But I mean, barring that, I have to believe that's a point where, like, the healing that has happened over the past few decades for him is really going to pick up some steam and some momentum for him. I don't think trauma is a thing that you ever truly heal or recover from. I think it becomes a part of you. And I think that this is going to help him make this a part of him in the most positive way. I sound so ignorant saying these things, but I think it can get him to the best resolution possible.
Yeah, when it comes to things like trauma, like really anything that goes into that category, if it's grieving someone or anything else, it's basically going to be something that does stay with you forever. I mean, if it's like anxiety, it's something you're basically going to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. It's never going to go away. It might just shrink little and little, but it's still going to be a voice that's going to be in the back of your head. It's going to maybe one day invade your thoughts again. It's something you will always be dealing with, and it is going to be something that Picard will continue to carry within him. But I think at this point, at least we're hoping so, because we haven't seen Picard season 2 yet. But I think we can safely say that at the very least that the Locutus voice has very much diminished, and especially with you now, that it's not gone for good, but at the very least it'll be a passing thought, and it won't harm him as much as the thought used to harm him.
True. I'm a bit reminded of have you guys heard of Romeo Dallaire? He was a colonel with the Canadian Armed Forces and he was serving in Rwanda, and that right before the Rwandan genocide occurred. He basically was told, as part of the UN security resolution, he was basically told to stand aside in that. And like, he had been there for a few years and made, friends and, connections with, with the people there and basically had to sit on the sidelines and that while all the trauma was occurring around him, and that he carried with him for a lot of years. Wrote a book about it, Shake Hands with the Devil, if anybody's interested in reading it. But he explores survivors' guilt and trauma very well, and is very open and honest about it. And he talks about how it can come back to you in, out of the blue. He remarked on a story in that where he was driving home during a snowstorm one night, and all of a sudden he had tried a few times before to commit suicide. This was how badly he was affected by the incident. And that he was driving home during a storm. He hadn't even thought about trauma all day, and in 1 second in that, he decided he was going to turn his car into an oncoming guardrail and go over the side. The only thing that stopped it was that it had been snowing so heavily that the snow had created an embankment, and that the car basically just rolled back into the road in that. But in that 1 second in that, everything came back and hit him like all at once. And that is the way trauma works. It'll come back to you when you least expect it.
I think for me, my biggest takeaway for this whole episode really is that when you're dealing with something like trauma, like anxiety, like depression, because these things are all kind of going to go together. They're the same family of negative traits to deal with. I think really the biggest takeaway you can take from what Captain Picard has learned throughout the many series and the films and everything is that really no man is an island. And that it's okay to seek help, and that's really what helps Picard get through things, is that he does seek help in different ways. Now, whether or not we're talking about the effectiveness of Counselor Troy, that's a whole other episode for another day, but in general, it's because he does eventually find his way towards other people who can put him on the path to, again, making that invasive thought a little bit less invasive. And so, I imagine for a lot of people who might be listening to this episode today, you're either really hardcore Trekkies, or you were just attracted to this topic because it's one that you deal with as well on an everyday basis. So, just remember out there that the internet is filled with all sorts of Trekkies just like us, and plenty of folks out there who are listening who are dealing with stuff too. So don't be afraid to reach out to your fellow strangers out there, because we're all one big happy family. All right, so I think that's going to be it for our discussion of Locutus, trauma, Borg, and all this real heavy, deep stuff. So one more time, let me just throw it to my guests who joined us, my co-hosts this week, just to kind of promote their shows one more time for you.
Yeah, thanks you so much again for having us on, especially to talk about such an important topic. I'm Jeff Akin, the host of the Starfleet Leadership Academy. You can get wherever you get your podcasts. And Matthew, you said earlier, and I want to put it out there again, that the Trek community online is incredible and amazing. And if anything in this episode touched you in a way and you want to talk about it or whatever and connect, please, I can't wait to talk to you and meet you. You can find me on all the social media at Jeff T. Akin. It's Akin. And thank you again, Matthew, for tackling this really, really important topic and for letting us be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Yeah, it is a very heavy topic in that, but Star Trek, throughout its history, I don't think has ever been afraid of trying to tackle a topic, that is difficult for a traditional show to talk about. So as for myself, you can catch me and the rest of the Strange New Pod crew every Thursday on your we're out there on all the podcast formats. You can catch me on Twitter at the Hawk 999. And yeah, I love the community that around Star Trek, and that ever since I joined the Strange New Pod cast, it's been an eye opener how much the show has affected people of so many different places in life.
And again, I'm Matthew from the Trek Untold podcast. You guys can check me out on social media at Trek Untold, and you can listen to the show wherever you find podcasts, and also in video form every Sunday on youtube.com/nerdnewstoday. And I gotta tell the listeners too, this is really the first time that I've ever interacted with Jeff and I've ever interacted with Hawk, and we basically came together to do this very difficult episode. And I'm really so happy that you guys are the ones who joined me here, because really it's such a tough thing, and I think you guys were the absolute perfect choices. I'm glad that you volunteered for this one too. That means that you guys had something really important to say also, and that you had some experiences that would bring a lot to the show, and I really think we all did here. So you guys were amazing. Thank you for being willing to chat about something that is not easy to chat about. So again, everybody out there, hope you will check out all of our shows, because really you should. Why aren't you listening to all of our shows? You should get on that. Fix that right now if you're not already. But yes, until next time, I'm going to also just give a shout out to Strange New Pod for putting together Captain Picard Week. So one more time, do check out strangenewpod.com to get the full lineup and schedule for everything happening during Captain Picard Week. And we will see you guys for Season 2 of Picard. It's coming oh so soon. So again, thank you all for listening. And until then, as I always say on my show, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com. Promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the Rageworks Podcasting Network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.